Welcome to The Truth in This Art. I am your host, Rob Lee, and today I'm super excited to bring on my next guest, a talented jazz artist known for his innovative use of the bass clarinet, and he's one of the few artists worldwide to focus on the bass clarinet as his main instrument in modern jazz with small and large ensembles. Please welcome Todd Marcus. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Good to have you on, and it's great. Like, I feel like, I've seen you on the social medias. I was like, who's this dude? Seen you on the different websites, like the different art sites as I'm doing my research. I'm like, all right. And then when we connected, I was like, okay, finally, it's happening. Let's do it. Let's make it happen. So now we're here, and I feel good about that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of those, I guess, also one of those nice highlights of Baltimore, right? Because I had similarly come across your work, and I think that it was maybe a year and a half ago that I first learned about. I forget how it came up, but I had a trip. I was driving out to Indiana to buy a new bass clarinet. So I had, it was like a 16-hour drive, and I loaded up on podcasts, and I had a couple of yours on there. And so, yeah, about a year and a half that I've been enjoying the focus and the coverage that you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, that's where those 30 downloads came from. So great. So, as we get started in this, I want to really open it up in sort of like general sense. Like, some people just go with, tell me about your work. I want to learn a bit about you as we kind of start this off. Like, where does your story start, and what was some of your early interests growing up? Doesn't have to be creative related, but just your interests. What were you into growing up? And, there's some other bullet points after that, but at least want to start there.
Well, I grew up in northern New Jersey, the suburbs. A lot of folks know the town Teaneck. I was a little town couple over from there called Hallworth, near the George Washington Bridge, so that part of New Jersey, and the suburbs of New York, and had a great childhood. My folks bought the house where I grew up my whole life, I think when I was just a little baby. And so I had the fortune of being, grounded there the whole time I grew up. And it wasn't until, maybe 7-8 years ago that after my dad passed, my mom sold the house. But a lot of memories of playing in the street, playing basketball in the driveway, stickball in the street. We lived on a dead end street, so there was a little section of woods at the end, and I had my phase where I was into remote controlled cars, and so created the ramp, the trail, the track for the cars, and was a creative kid. My mom was the one that made sure my brother and I had music introduction. And then from there, played in elementary school and high school and band and all that kind of stuff. But kind of a good mix of all things music related, but also athletics, and then just like other creative stuff like building things. And when I came to Baltimore, I went to school at Loyola for 2.5 years. I was studying political science. But then I started volunteering in what would become my neighborhood, Sandtown, Winchester. Every Saturday I would come and I work at Sandtown Habitat for Humanity. Yeah. And so did construction for several years. And then moved into the neighborhood, stopped school, moved into the neighborhood, and did construction for several years. So, I've got a lot of these different kind of interests and passions that have been part of my life throughout my life.
That's great. And I saw the Loyola detail there. I may or may not have worked at Loyola for a bit.
Okay.
And because the day job is higher ed. And yeah, I mean, and I like the stickball thing. That definitely is a up north, New York, New Jersey sort of thing. Yeah. So how did your work within music? How did that come about? Like, especially in using an instrument, from what I understand, is less common these days in the jazz world.
Yeah, I played the clarinet as a kid, and clarinet is an instrument that, as far as jazz goes, was very prominent in early jazz out of New Orleans, and then into the big band era. But then it really kind of almost disappeared entirely during the next phases of the music, bebop and post bop, and saxophone became king.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was I kind of had a later start in jazz, and when I got to college, it was a first chance to play in the school jazz band there, and I met a friend that gave me a record to listen to, and I heard a guy named Eric Dolphy, who was kind of like the godfather of the bass clarinet in jazz, and so I said, oh man, there's a lot of potential with this instrument, and then I got my hands on one, and so I've been I drank that Kool-Aid, so to speak. I've been down that. What is it? The red pill. I took the red pill and the Matrix, and I've been exploring that reality ever since.
Okay, I like it. I like it. When I see Bop, because I was like, I know Eric Dolphy. I was like, Charles Mingus. I was like, that's one of my guys. So absolutely. And
yeah, I mean, and the thing that was significant about Eric Dolphy, he was such a unique individual. He was from the West Coast, and then he came to New York, and like you said, he was working with Charles Mingus, and a very notable collaboration with John Coltrane. And but he was unique. The way he played as a person, he was just like, all accounts, that he was just this really sweet, clean-cut guy, and he died tragically when he was young, 36 years old. He had stayed over in Europe after a tour with Mingus, and then he had undiagnosed diabetes, and he died. Kind of a tragic early death. But one of these guys, it was so unique that he's kind of like got a cult status, and there's like legions of people that revere his work. And there was a festival in Montclair, New Jersey a few years back, Eric Dolphy Festival. And he was just so unique that it's like I said, it's almost like this cult. It's this following of people that is so strong because of this path that he blazed with the saxophone, with the flute, but so uniquely with the bass clarinet.
Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. So in terms of influences in that sort of way, what is it about maybe some of the influence you had? You mentioned Dolphy there. Some of the influences that you have, some of the people that you're kind of like, wow, this is, because it may not be necessarily someone that maybe plays the same instrument, maybe not even someone that's even a musician. Talk about some of your influences and how that maybe influences or directs how you go about your music, how you go about your work, your style of playing and such.
I think that there would be a couple things. Influences, some of the people that were big influences were John Coltrane and his piano player McCoy Tyner, and another great pianist, Chick Corea. Those were some of those folks from that era that I really ended up falling in love with, that were influences. But then you also very significantly have got, for me as this bass clarinet player, this very rare instrument in jazz, you've got people like Dolphy, you've got people like Benny Maupin, who is known for his work using the instrument with Miles Davis. You've got Don Byron, who's came a kind of a next generation that really introduced the clarinet and bass clarinet into a little more of a modern, straight ahead approach in jazz. And so guys like them are really significant to me. It's kind of being trailblazers and sort of showing, hey, it's possible. Like anytime you don't see a certain representation, right? And then you see people that are doing it, it shows you, hey, there's stuff that can be done, and there's a kinship with that, and there's a solidarity with that. And so those guys, some of them that are not stylistic influences on me, are still very important, because they showed me, hey, this was possible, and they introduced me to stuff that would become my path that I would explore and take on my own direction with the instrument.
I like that a lot. And that kind of brings me to this in terms of like how you went about like learning sort of the craft, learning the skills and and learning to play ultimately. How was that? Because I think a lot of times there isn't the freshest of roadmaps sometimes, or a roadmap at all, in kind of what I do. And it's just, you're figuring it out. You're being self-taught. I don't really regard myself as being self-taught, because it's kind of like, can you talk to a person? But talk about that, some of the training and some of the education that went into you and your work.
Yeah, and I think that that's it's interesting to hear you talk about your approach in interviewing and podcasting and publishing, because it makes me think about some of the similarities I would say I feel in my work. So I'm self-taught when it comes to jazz. You know, I grew up playing clarinet, as I said, in school, and I had lessons, so I learned to read music and and play in ensembles, and that was a great foundation for me. But when it came to jazz, I taught myself theory and harmony
Yeah.
and composition and improvisation. Really, kind of the way that it was done, the old school way, which was listening to records, listening, learning, studying. Oftentimes, we call it in music, we call it transcribing. You know, you learn the solo, and you learn it by ear, or you learn a few notes, hear a few notes at a time, and write them down, and that way you build up that vocabulary. And so that was the way that I did it, and it's kind of interesting because it came on the cusp of when jazz was really transitioning more into academia,
Yeah.
and more the norm that people would go to college for jazz. And this is at a similar time that, you know, a lot of venues that traditionally, a lot of the neighborhood places that would have jazz throughout the week, or at least on the weekends, neighborhood kind of smaller spots were disappearing, and and so I feel fortunate to have had that kind of old school experience, and you know, there's a certain pride that I taught myself a lot of what I've learned. Um, it's interesting now, you know, where stuff is so much in schools, as a lot of those older places and venues don't exist. Things have changed radically, and and so now there's a degree to which um, being in school is not only, I think, a learning opportunity, but it's also then a networking
Mhm.
setting, you know, because you just don't have the same prevalence of touring bands and a chance with band leaders to apprentice with an established band leader, right? So things have changed. Things have changed.
That's it's interesting because, like, macroly speaking, like jazz has always been looked at as, at least from my vantage point, just kind of very interesting and something that I felt may have been valued weirdly, as far as like how, like, we don't want you to go into jazz. It's not nothing in here. It's got all of this other stuff that goes along with it. And then seeing that it is definitely something that people speak about more. But I feel like there's like maybe three places that I'm aware of, and maybe my own ignorance, that, hey, I can go to and hear music more than, you know, once for some very special occasion. And I don't think that that's always been that way. I feel like, you know, there was always places to kind of pick up a gig and do work and be around musicians. And, you know, as I was like articulating to you before we got started, I've been trying to put together a series of interviews, you know, because I recognize my own sort of shortcomings. And I think the way that, again, macroly speaking, it was presented to me was sort of smooth jazz. No. I need something that bops. I need something that hits you over the head. That's the type of stuff that I'm into. And I think if that was presented to me initially and then moved into it, I could be a musician now. I could have dove into it to that degree. And what is your take on the jazz music in Baltimore, as a person that is a musician? Like, what is your take on it here in terms of like getting gigs, in terms of how it's treated and how it's appreciated, just that scene overall?
Well, it's an interesting time for jazz in Baltimore because, in a lot of ways, the scene is the strongest it has been in a long time.
Yeah.
And I remember back late '90s when I was getting into the music and you know, was full time in Baltimore, and there was a place over by Morgan with in the Northwood Shopping Plaza that just recently, you know, has been completely redone.
Yeah.
But there was a place called the New Haven Lounge.
I know New Haven Lounge.
And, you know, the Haven had music on the weekends. And back in the day, there had been national names. The big name guys, they all knew the Haven because they had come through and played it.
Yeah.
Even some recordings there. But, you know, by the late '90s, early 2000s, that was one of the few places that regularly was doing the music. And if you didn't like what was playing at the Haven, well, you kind of, if you were lucky, there was a show going on at the Caton Castle over on the west side. Otherwise, you had to go down to DC to catch something, or take the long trip up to New York. And so now we've got a few more venues, not a ton of venues, but we've got a lot of musicians that are here. Really, more and more people are moving to Baltimore, and so the scene is very rich with really accomplished musicians. And then between us and DC, which really for us in the area is like it's just one big working area. You can do okay as a professional working musician in the area between the different venues, and a lot of musicians teach, of course, and then do private party gigs. So the days of New York being the ultra mecca are kind of changed, because even in New York, and this is before the pandemic, you had fewer places, and it's and again, the schools are kicking out so many people on graduating with jazz degrees, and it's just there's not the infrastructure to support that much work for the number of musicians. So you really have to be creative. A lot of times, kind of doing your own thing. Sometimes having some other work that subsidizes you, so you can do your art, so you can continue to sustain. But that's what I would say is kind of like the mix of the scene for jazz in Baltimore right now.
That helps, because in listening to it, like, I've had, and I think a piece of what I was getting at earlier may have been attributed to the pandemic, when this idea first presented itself and popped in my head, and now it's like being more dipped into the scene. And knowing a few more names, it's like, oh, okay, cool. This person does that, great. Or even having that sort of DC to Baltimore connection. I remember speaking with Elijah Baldbed and the Jogo Project, and I remember reaching out to the folks down there in DC, and they weren't aware of it. 202 Creates. It was like, who is that? What is that? I was like, that is one of your own people. Can we sort this out? And last in September, I helped organize a show, actually a Jogo Project show at Keystone, and trying to make, because it's for me it's important, and I don't want to see it as this is a documentary thing. Like, no, this should be a thing that's living and out there and accessible in a way. So whenever the opportunity presents itself, my partner has a family in DC, so we did a jazz night down there, and some club was like, this is fire, this is great. And then we returned the favor in December of having them come up and go to Keystone with us, for Jogo doing their sort of Christmas show. And it was kind of like this sort of like fire exchange of community in a very condensed way, and jazz being a big part of it, and that sort of music being a big part of it.
And I think that it's great hearing you talk about that, because I think that there's a parallel between that and even what I've heard you talk about with your podcast, and that it is this interesting time where there's tremendous power and ability for us to kind of DIY things, right? And 15, 20, 30 years ago, that was not the reality. The tech wasn't there. The access wasn't there. You had to go through the gatekeepers, through different channels, existing networks, and those had value. Now, don't get me wrong. There's plus and minuses, right? But now, kind of either because of the availability of different tech and options for us, and the necessity, we kind of have to kind of grind and do these things and make our own scenes and our own situations much of the time, which is exhausting, but it's also, it does allow us to create some really interesting content and stuff and events.
And I'm always like looking for where's the interesting stuff happening. And I turned to Tomo's pitch man when I was putting out there the proposal to get the funding and all of that. I was like, it's this with that, man, it's got to happen. It's a fusion, and just really going off on it. And I think it's very important, because I've really been playing with this idea of how we treat culture in a sort of macro sense. And I think, as we move further and further ahead in time, the annals of history, they become eroded. And that's where I was kind of coming from with this idea of, I don't want to hear about it in a documentary sort of way, because the people who lived it and knowing who are those kind of holders of that culture and that history, they kind of die out. And then, as we know, things get reframed from maybe a smaller perspective. And I think it's a preservation thing that happens, but also, like, what's that next sort of generation that's bringing things along?
Yeah, and I think it's huge because it's covering the scene, it's giving people their acknowledgement and respect while they're still with us,
giving them their flowers.
Yeah, and I think that's important. There's a colleague of mine, a wonderful saxophone player down in D.C. named Antonio Parker, and he's been doing, he calls it Conversations in Jazz, and he does it as a YouTube series, and he interviews all these different musicians from mainly the DC area, but it's the same thing that we gotta capture a lot of these interviews, these conversations, especially with some of our elders, while there's still time. And there's one real kind of poignant interview he did with a drummer who was a staple of the DC scene for many years, who then passed away during the pandemic from COVID. And so, suddenly, here, the fact that he did this interview, man, it took on this even heightened significance and relevance and historical role.
Yeah. I mean, really being able to capture that stuff. And, even looking at, like, here, in Baltimore, where, it's, the city is changing rapidly. I look back at some of those early interviews, not even, 3, 4, or 4 years ago, have you, where some of that stuff some of those places don't exist anymore, and some of those people aren't here anymore, don't live here physically anymore. And their work has grown in such a way. So it's like really capturing it, archiving that, and then taking it to sort of that, where are we at now? How are things changed now? And, sometimes you look at, a city that is developing and is growing in a way, and what are these new things that are coming in, and where does culture, whether it's arts, whether it's performance, because I think the notion of people going out to a place, and that's the thing that really is, I think, in danger at times. There's a way of capturing it, whether it's through streaming and so on, like capturing a performance, but it's something about being there, and that's the thing that I really want to find a way to kind of keep that. And I think, there's limited space sometimes of, all right, we can only have 50 people here tonight because, COVID and all of that. Then let's have a secondary venue, let's have a tertiary venue and so on, to kind of keep that out there, keep that spirit out there. So I want to, and I think you touched on this, but I want to dive back into it. I always ask about, like, life experiences that kind of help shape your creative sensibility. Like, I keep thinking about, like, and one was recent for me. I did this talk, Creative Mornings talk, about this concept of truth. And I got really personal in it. And rarely I do that. Usually I'm the person asking the questions. I got all the questions. You need to have the answers. But being on that side of it, of really being vulnerable and sharing, I was like, oh, I understand, maybe having a further appreciation of maybe what the guest encounters when they're coming on and sharing their story. And that's helped shape my creative sensibility. What is that for you? Like, what helps? Like, is there an experience that comes to mind that helps shape your creative sensibility?
I would say maybe a couple aspects of where my life have just been wrapped up with the resulting art that I've made. One would be, by nature of me being Egyptian, that has really impacted my work and creativity over the past decade plus. Yeah. So, my dad, he immigrated from Egypt and married my mom in the States. And when I was in 7th grade, that was the first time that we as a family went back. My dad hadn't gone back in 27 years. And so we went as a family, and, all the adults were socializing. Me and my other little cousins, we were running the streets of Cairo. And so I had these amazing experiences of that. And then, just trips over the years in Cairo, Alexandria, and some of the smaller little towns we would pass through by train. And then even just the last few years as an adult, making return trips, performing there,
Yeah.
And taking my wife for the first time. And so for me, the significance of that is that as growing up in New Jersey without a Middle Eastern, without an Egyptian community around, at a certain point in adulthood, I started to want to explore more of my culture and heritage through music. And I asked my dad for some records, and he had some that he had brought with him when he immigrated, and that I fell in love with that music. And so I've done a lot of incorporating that. And then the two musics, jazz and Middle Eastern music, they don't naturally go together. Yeah. They're very different. And so it took it was like a puzzle. I was trying to figure out, how can I make this work and get them to fuse them together. So that's been a big example, yeah, of that kind of impact of stuff on my art. And then maybe the other one of note of recent years is I live in West Baltimore in the Sandtown Winchester community, right along Pennsylvania Avenue. And for folks that don't know, our neighborhood, Sandtown Winchester and Upton, right next to each other. And that was like the Harlem of Baltimore for decades, for generations. And so I moved into the neighborhood in 97. And I've been here. This is a resident, and then also part of a community nonprofit that I'm one of the co-founders of. And so just my experiences learning, living in my neighborhood. And then I kind of culminated in 2015 after the death of Freddie Gray. Yeah. And, as we do as artists, oftentimes we kind of process our surroundings into our art. And so that began kind of what became an album a couple of years later called On These Streets, a Baltimore Story. And it was kind of my way as a musician to give a musical portrait of my neighborhood here in West Baltimore. A lot of the challenges certainly that people know about and harp on, but also a lot of the positives that people don't know when they're just stuck on the negative stereotypes. So that's another example where different kind of influences and settings and circumstances have impacted my music and my artistry.
Thank you for sharing that. Talk about, if you will, your process, your creative process, like the conception to sort of completion. Like, what are those major like milestones within that process, within that continuum? For me, the more challenging part in doing this and ultimately putting this together, this is somewhere in the midpoint, actually doing the interview, right? But in the beginning of it, getting the good information to come up with questions that I think are useful and pertinent. Don't want to just ask the same questions. Like, here are the 5 questions that I ask everybody. There's some repetition, obviously, but I think how one asks it, you maybe get a different response from a person. And then, towards the end of it is actually when it goes out or when it's ready and in post-production, all of that. But there's still more things that go in it. Like, all right, what's the graphic going to look like? When I'm going to post it? Who I'm going to share it with? And, should I send it to some blog? Should I put it in a newsletter? All of these like post things. And that's that full sort of process. So for you, like, what does your process look like overall? Like any part of it, 'cause I'm sure it's multifaceted, but tell us about like your part of your creative process and like what goes into it.
It's a lot. It's a lot. It's multi-phase, multi-steps. It's exhausting. So on the artsy fun side of it is just like, loving music and practicing and learning, or different ideas that I apply in my improvisation. Something that I've been doing. Let's see. A few things that during the pandemic I focused on was incorporating Middle Eastern sounds into my improvisation. I'd already been doing it with the compositions, but doing that with my improvisation. And then, there's always I got a couple different concepts that I've been working on and incorporating into my playing. I remember years ago, there was a great saxophonist named Yusef Lateef, and he was talking about John Coltrane, and he talked about Coltrane and it's like how he was this relentless practicer. And he said, John was like a cup, and he would always be putting these different pieces of information into the cup, just to the point that it was overflowing. And so I like that. That's on the fun side of exploring and being creative and figuring out stuff you want to incorporate as an improviser. That's part of the process. Also, composition. I sit down at the piano. Usually my composition comes from different things that I am inspired by. For me, going out and hearing other people is huge because I get inspiration from hearing other people. And I might hear somebody do something in their playing or a composition. I like, oh, I like that. I could do something with that. And then I'll kind of go home and then jot down that little idea, and I'll sit at the piano and come up with a composition, or maybe a little fragment, and then maybe another fragment a month later, and then a couple months later. And then a lot of times I'll knit those together. So I have almost like this collage of a composition that came from these different ideas that I quilted together. But separate from that, then there's all the unsexy side of stuff, like reaching out to venues, emails after emails after emails after calls after emails after calls, trying to get dates. And then, oh, you got the date. Now you got to promote it, and you got to, line up the musicians, and you got to work on their travel and setting up the hotels, and then, like promoting it. And, it's just exhausting. And it's the kind of stuff that as a musician, as a band leader, you're doing that, and then you're like, oh wait, we got this show in a week, and I haven't hardly touched my horn this week because I'm so busy dealing with this other stuff. So that's kind of some of the stuff, the process. And then of course, when you got if you got a new record out, you're also then trying to spread the word about that. Oh, and then of course all this social media stuff now that we gotta be tending to, right? This stuff is crazy, and so it's like all this stuff, back to what we were saying earlier, it's great that we have this available to us. It gives us the power of determining our own destiny to a certain degree. But it's a lot of time.
Yeah.
And there's only so much of us to split, so it's tricky. It's challenging.
Yeah. I've been on.
So if you don't love it, if you don't love this, if you don't love podcasting, if you don't love making music, man, do something else. Sit in the couch, watch some Star Trek, because you're gonna waste a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it on, trying to get the, that project I was telling you about organized, like at Keystone, and that was a long process to get that sorted out and squared away, and because for me, I'm always trying to extend and pick up new things versus, I don't want to be a stale podcaster. I don't want to I am one trick pony. I don't want to just do that. So I'm always tweaking and looking for ways to refine and grow. And, I do these movie nights, and like you said, just in doing that, I'm booking the venue. I'm in bringing the guests on, finding out what they need, making sure everything is set, getting the movie, getting the funding. And at times I'll forget, like, oh, right. And while doing the podcast schedule and my other obligations, snap, I needed to review this movie and prepare since I'm hosting this night. And that just falls to the wayside. It's like you're ensuring that everything needs to get done for every other part of it. And then somehow you don't want to come off as the weak link within it. Like you said, like, I haven't touched my horn in a while. What's going on here?
Yeah, it requires planning, organization, multitasking. It's intense.
Yeah. So I got, I think 3 more real questions. One has a lot of points to it, but I want to go with this one. This one, I did try to be brief in it, at least more so for me because I talk a lot. Can you describe some of the notable artists that you've worked with, and what was like the nature of the collaboration? Like, was it, we did some writing together, we did a few sessions together, we did a show together, we played together. Tell me about some of the notable people that come to mind for you.
It varies. As far as some notable folks, I'm very happy that I've had the chance to do some work over recent years with a saxophonist named Gary Bartz, who is a native Baltimorean, actually grew up in the Sandtown, Winchester community, so it's a real special aspect for me. Yeah. But, before I knew any of that, I came to his playing because I heard his music, his playing. I heard him playing with McCoy Tyner, one of the great jazz pianists of all time, and one of the great pianists of all time, and fell in love with his playing, his albums. And then when I learned that he was from Baltimore, that was just like a special kinship. And so having the chance to, get to talk with him and then to do some playing over the years, for me, that was very special. It's like when, you meet your heroes and then get to become peers and make music together. So that was very special. Another example is a guy I mentioned earlier, Benny Maupin, someone that is a saxophonist and flautist, composer, but also bass clarinetist, and very famous for his work with Miles Davis. Miles Davis has an album called Bitches Brew from the late 60s. It was a very popular fusion album. And so, back in 2012, I had reached out to Benny Maupin, and he came to Baltimore and was a guest with my jazz orchestra, and we did a concert. And we had a little conversation leading up to that with logistics and everything. But that was the only date we did. I reached out to him a few times afterwards, and unfortunately, it didn't work out to get him on some others. So, it was just that one time, but a very special memory and experience for me. And, another guy that I would think of is Don Byron, who is the other person I mentioned that was a real kind of trailblazer on the clarinet. And for us to get to know each other over the years. And then we've done a bunch of touring together, a lot of performances together. And, having that kinship, that's special. So those are a few folks that come to mind offhand, and a lot of other wonderful musicians and some big name folks that I've had the chance to get to know. And it's nice to get to know folks as a peer, and you see people that are just beautiful and the sweetest people, and then some folks that kind of let you down with when you start to be around them a little bit. But I love it all, because this is just seeing all these different folks, hearing their stories, especially the elders, meeting new people. There's a clarinetist that I just worked with for the first time this year, who's a bit younger than I am, up in Canada, but an amazing clarinetist named Virginia McDonald, and we did some playing together. So hopefully that'll be a new relationship where we make music for years to come. And I love that. Being a band leader, and on an unusual instrument, I don't have as many calls for sideman work. So when I get the chance through my own work as a band leader or rare sideman opportunities to work with other folks, it's just a kinship there. It's community building, and it's really meaningful to me.
That's wonderful. I love the when those opportunities present themselves. Like now, I can work with someone, do some consulting to help with some storytelling, or it may be something that's slightly different than what I normally do. It's like, oh yeah, you can run a show, and it's like, oh, I'm hosting a thing and moderating a panel. I wasn't expecting that, and being able to chat with people who, I joke about it all the time, who are much more talented than me. I might mean that, but much more talented than me. And being able to be up there and have a conversation and having them answer my questions, having the time and the consideration to answer my questions, and just seeing people, it normalizes and it personalizes. And it's community at the end of the day to me. Mm-hmm. So this is a question that I'm really, really, really interested in. You touched on being able to, to play in Egypt, and you played all around, here in different parts of the U.S. and, internationally, obviously. What is it like performing in front of large audiences and smaller audience, more intimate audiences? What is that feeling that you have in performing, or have you? Like, how does that feel? Like, I have terrible stage fright at times. So if someone asks me, it's like, it feels like indigestion. That's what it feels like. For you, what does it feel like, regardless of the size of the audience? And maybe it's a difference there, but what does it feel like performing in front of a large audience or in front of like a smaller, more intimate audience?
I would say that more of my work has been in front of medium and smaller size audiences, just because of a lot of the venues that I play in. And there are some of my colleagues that are out in the road jazz wise that are playing larger kind of stadium stuff. I haven't done a ton of that. And I actually kind of like the smaller setting venues, both acoustically, for jazz. That's where it really is heard best and I feel performed best. But but also there's an intimacy, I think, that you get from those settings. And, when we say medium, it'd be like 200, 300, 400 seat venue, but
Yeah.
still compared to I've got colleagues that are out there doing these stadium things, and it's like a different kind of thing. And I think the advantage of when you're in whether it's a club or a smaller concert hall, is that there's the chance to have a real intimacy and connection with your audience.
Yeah.
And if we do our job well as musicians, presenting engaging music that's shaped well, that's composed and constructed well, and then solos that tell a story, what happens is that you start forming this connection with the audience, and they're really engaged. And oftentimes you hear it after a solo, and people will really just, there'll be that release of the applause and positivity, and it's like it becomes this transcendent experience.
Yeah.
To me, which really makes me think about how in a lot of cultures, musicians have almost like a more of a spiritual kind of role. And when I experience that, I am reminded why, because it really is this transcendental type experience where you as the musician and the audience, you are all elevated together. Yeah. And it's amazing. It's just, whenever I'm in that grind of feeling frustrated or struggling, I remember those moments, and that's what keeps me going as far as grinding through the slog of the not fun part of music making, because it's getting back to that is just incredible and powerful.
That made me think of this. I went to this venue. I think it was 930 Club maybe, and it's in DC. So one of my favorite acts, Tori Ivoire, was playing. He was doing tracks from his new album that was coming out at the time, and he played one of my favorite songs from I think it's called Rose Quartz. Sometimes it's like I know the melody but may forget the title, and I had this sense that I felt like I was levitating. I was like, this is amazing. And every time I listen to that song subsequently, I feel like I'm back in that moment. I've listened to it before, listened to it after, but I go back to that moment.
Yeah.
And definitely, I just felt like we were in this experience together. It was a really great experience, and I feel like that's one of the powers of music and powers of live music specifically.
Yeah, definitely. And that, in this day and age where everybody is listening to stuff on their cell phones and everything. Oh man, it's great that we have that tech that stuff is so accessible, but you don't get that experience from watching somebody on your cell phone. You get that from being live in person and having that connection. And there's an energy that is exchanged, and there's that special marker moment, like you talking about, that you hear that song now and your mind goes back to that moment where you were there at 930 Club experiencing that.
Yeah. And
that's seared in your brain.
I had this observation earlier. I was listening to this audiobook, and it was a segment about the digital and analog and all of this stuff, and it presented me with a question of how do we decide in this sort of ever growing digital situation that we're in. You have Spotify, you have less things, everything is in the cloud, everything is digital, you have less ownership of these items, right? Or of a copy of said item. And I don't know what to really do with that. I felt like if I'm going out to buy someone's record, there's more value in that. But if I can just easily get it and there was no work put into it other than signing up for it and having this, it's like it's passive pirating in some ways. Yeah. And it's not to knock it, but at the same time, that's really what it is. And I look at what physical media I have is mostly DVDs. I'm definitely a movie person, but I have vinyl. I don't really have CDs anymore, but I have vinyl, and I'm looking at this Tori Ivoire album right now. So there you go.
Yeah, look, back to just the pros and cons of this technical age that we're in. It's tough times being a musician, because you trying to sell your albums now is extremely tough. I mean, the whole collapse of the record industry, as far as the disappearance of music stores, right? With the internet now, everything's on the internet, right? Well, that's cool, but if you're a musician, you put all this money and time into making an album, and then you trying to sell it and make your money back. Well, people don't have CD players anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it just and if folks will go to the internet and everything, and it's tough. It's tough, and it's great that it helps you get the word out there, but it's challenging. And and then people will love to record stuff with their cell phone, and I feel conflicted about this. Like I'll be at my performances. I've tried to think about how can I tactfully do this, and I feel like I got a good approach. I'll say, all right, folks, so. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed this last song. I seen a lot of people got their cell phones out. That tells me you're digging it. You're loving what you're seeing. You want to capture it. But look, we spent a lot of money recording this, and you can get this professionally recorded version of this song. It's going to make your cell phone version of it now look like nothing. So please buy our album.
I do like being able to repurpose like kind of like old and defeated tech, and but I think it's experiences. It's how do you add some degree of exclusivity to it. And because I'm doing an audio medium, and that's obviously it's out there through many of these platforms, and that's how it gets out there. Like if this was, I don't know if this turns into a comedy record. I don't know what it turns into. If if we went back to like everything was vinyl, everything was tapes, it would probably be something on the radio, I suppose. But yeah, I kind of want to dip back into that. Like there's something that's still there. There's a heartbeat there for sort of this quote unquote dead tech. Like maybe podcasts on vinyl, maybe podcasts on like a cassette tape, but something that has the exclusivity to it of, I did this really cool interview with this person and we're releasing this only on vinyl. That's literally where it's going. And I don't know, but I definitely have seen more and more people performing as a response. It's like, all right, everybody, we're going to do this song. Take out your cameras, do your thing real quick. But once we start playing, please put those things away. Buy our record,
Yeah.
So this is the last real question I got for you, and it's more of an invitation, really. Tell us about Intersection of Change. I read a bit about that, and I want to give you the floor for that.
Well, Intersection of Change is the other half of my life, music being one half, and then Intersection of Change is our community nonprofit in West Baltimore, here in our Sandtown, Winchester, and Upton communities, right on Pennsylvania Avenue, and we're very much focused on addressing poverty-related challenges in our neighborhood. And we've got 3 different programs that we run. The first one we started in 2000 is Martha's Place, and that's our recovery program for women overcoming substance abuse and homelessness. And there weren't places in our neighborhood for women in recovery, and that's where we moved to respond to that need. And then in 2008, we started a second program that's called Jubilee Arts, and it does all types of different art classes. It's ceramics, visual arts, dance, you name it. We just added some recent classes in candle making, we youth business, entrepreneurial classes, mural making. And so that really is very arts focused for our community and providing community building and outlet and expression for our community residents. And then the third program is called Strength to Love 2, and that uses an 1.5 acre farm in our community on the west end of our neighborhood to address the food apartheid issue, make sure we can try to tackle away at that food access issue, but also do workforce development. And so that is the work. Those are the 3 programs that we do that are part of the overall community development work that we're doing. We're very unique, I think, in that we are very much a community-based organization.
Yeah.
You hear that term a lot, but in our case, it's very, very authentic. 2 of our other founders, Elder C.W. Harris and Amelia Harris, are lifelong community residents of the neighborhood. And so when I moved into the neighborhood, it was largely in meeting them and being mentored by them that I learned about our community. And the 3 of us worked together, and we've over the years and brought a lot of staff on and been fighting for our neighborhood. So that's the work we're doing. That's what we're doing.
It's great to hear. And thank you for that, because, I think a lot of times we only have so many hours, especially when we're going after what we're doing creatively. But I think a lot of times people aren't of the community and doing work for the community that they're in. So bravo to you for the work that you're doing. So now it's time to get into the rapid fire.
Rapid fire. Bring it on.
I've been adding questions. One is ridiculous. Well, most of them are ridiculous, but just, keep in mind, brevity is key here. Don't overthink them. I'm going to start off with a softball for you. In terms of when you're most productive, what you enjoy most, when you are at your peak. Is it morning or night? You're a morning person or a night person?
Man, it's interesting. So I've almost all my life been a night owl. My dad was the ultimate night owl. I must have inherited that from him. And, 10 o'clock on and 2 a.m., that's me. That's my time. And then the pandemic came and there was no gigs to go to. And suddenly I guess about a year and a half in, and I started going to bed earlier, and I haven't recovered, man. And it's fairly rare that I'm that same late night schedule. I had a gig in Toronto this summer, and the gig it was Friday, Saturday, and each night it went to 2 a.m. And I said, man, what kind of mess is this? Who's out here 2 a.m. Man, I didn't go to bed. So I'm changing a little bit.
I hear you.
I was a night owl, but I'm changing.
Yeah, that kind of the same thing for me. I find that I put on a TV show at times, and I've been on this kick of revisiting the X-Files, and it just puts me to sleep. Like, I'll get through one episode, I get to that second one, I'm done. Yeah. And I got to find something. I'll wake up just briefly enough to turn off the TV and go to sleep, because sometimes it gets a little reckless, and the diet's like, why is there so much screaming? Oh, I'm still watching X-Files.
I hear you, man. I set a new record the other night. I fell asleep on a couch after I was watching some Star Trek, and I said, well, let me hit the pause button because I'm definitely drowsing off. I woke up, it was 6 a.m. I had never been that late, and so I got up to the bed. My wife said, what time is it? 6 o'clock. So, yeah.
So I'll be remiss if I don't go into this one then. So which Star Trek? The old school OG Star Trek, Next Generation, Voyager, other Deep Space Nine? What is your Star Trek of choice?
I grew up on Star Trek: The Next Generation and the movies of the original series.
Yeah.
And then during the pandemic, I had never watched Voyager. I had never watched Deep Space Nine. I had never watched Enterprise. So that was my mental health treatment for myself, watching those during the pandemic. And so, I'd say I love them all. The new ones, it's been great seeing new series being made. Man, a lot of them, they're pretty rough. It's like
Lower Decks.
Everything is dramatic, and people and their issues, and can't we go back to Spock and logic is king? So, but yeah, I can't not watch. I'm an addict. I'm a Star Trek addict.
I dig it. So this next question you're gonna like as well, probably. Because there's always this sort of competition between Star Trek and Star Wars. So if this was dumped in your hand right now, which one do you take? Phaser or lightsaber?
Oh man, I gotta say, set my phaser on stun because I'm a Trekkie. But
I love it.
But I'll admit, look, I love all things sci-fi, and so I have watched all of this stuff, and Disney is getting their money out of me because they're making all these additional series, and I can't not watch these things. Mr. Sci-Fi lover, so they got me.
I hear you. Every place in Star Wars rather, is a desert. It's every place is a desert. It's like, oh, we're in Andor. Oh, there's sand again. Isn't that something? Oh, we're in Obi-Wan. Yep, more sand. All right.
Yep.
So I got three more for you. Let's see. What's your favorite country you visited? In the last, let's say, few years. Always live vicariously through people when they travel. So you've traveled to, I've heard you mention Toronto, I heard you mention Egypt. So what's been the best place that you've traveled, your favorite place that you've traveled in the last few years?
I'm going to stick with Egypt. For me, obviously I have that connection because I still have family there. And there's an affinity from having made trips so many times over the years. But each time I go back, when I land in the airport, there's something about that desert air that I feel that, I smell that, and it's like, like you were saying earlier, like a memory of being at that show that is seared in your brain, right?
Mhm.
And for me, it's like I land, and then suddenly I have that memory back to like the first time I was there as a kid, and it's very special. And so, yeah, I haven't gotten tired of going back to Egypt yet.
You're making me want to visit. With my unofficial, like half official, unofficial heritage, you make me want to visit. I just got to get my beard longer, and I'll just pull up. I just pull up.
When you're ready to do it, let me know, and I'm going to hook you up so you can have a good experience.
That's a bet. So with it, that brings me to, I always ask food questions, as you probably know at this point.
Yep.
So because I like people, like I'm a somewhat adventurous eater, or what have you. I'll try different things. What are 3 sort of entry level Middle Eastern foods you would suggest someone try? Like people are like, I don't eat this, I don't eat that. It's only this. It's like, this is good. You should try it.
So, I will say that I love hummus, but hummus is actually Lebanese, so I can't say that. But I would say that 3 Egyptian dishes. One is called koshari, and it's kind of it's a lot of different things kind of mixed all in together. Very tasty. There is some of the kebabs are pretty delicious. I've got some wonderful memories of that. And then there's a soup. It's called malachia, and it's kind of this very green soup, and depending on who makes it, it's either great or it's terrible. So those are a few Egyptian dishes that I would offer.
I'm looking at it now. I was like, that is very green. Dude, this is the last one I got for you. So I think you were describing something that I do, describing something that you were doing today that I do as well. I like to go into a place and really walk around, absorb what's around. And inevitably, you're going to overhear some things. Sometimes it's like, oh, okay, I got some inspiration for that. Other times, you're just walking away snickering because you've heard something really funny that you probably should not have heard. And I go to something that was very ridiculous. It was a guy, like people that are just yelling into the speakerphone. And he was just like, no, the other murder. I was like, excuse me? I was like, how does that work? And that's just been a bit within the family for a while. What is something really funny that you've overheard recently just in your travels that you're like, I feel like I heard part of this and I haven't heard the whole thing. This is funny. What is something that's really funny that you've heard recently?
I'm thinking about now. You make me think about a negative one. I was going to a jam session the other day, and I'm walking down the block, and this isn't overheard, but kind of walked into, and the venue is on the corner, and I'm there, and I see a guy I know, a piano player that I know, and the cops are in the middle of the street, and the lights are on. And he said, "Hey, Todd." I was like, "Hey, man, how you doing?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I forgot you live on this block." He said, "Yeah, I just got mugged." And so the cops are here, and they took my phone and my wallet and my Indian food. So that wasn't. I guess I was kind of overhearing, right? I walked into that one, and that kind of ruined my day, and just to the challenges we're struggling with. It was a very kind of real one. So not a fuzzy happy way to end this interview, I suppose, but.
It's a real thing. And, the part that almost took me out, it's like somebody took my Indian food as well. It's like, look, can they at least leave the man with this?
Yeah.
Leave him with this chana masala? That would be great, please.
His partner came up and said, "Yeah, I'm more pissed off about our Indian food."
I wouldn't know. Indian food is expensive.
So that answers your question. That was something I overheard that was crazy. That made me laugh.
That is great. And see, we saved it. We made it work. So thank you so much for being on this podcast. And I want to invite and encourage you to let the folks know where they can check you out, your work, and any of the fine stuff you're doing, website, social media. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So the best place for my music work is to go to toddmarcusjazz.com. You can get everything there, all my social media links and everything. And then for community work, go to intersectionofchange.org, and you can track all of our happenings there and our 3 programs there as well.
Thank you so much for that. And Yeah. So for the great Todd Marcus, I'm Rob Lee, saying that there is art, culture, music, all of that good stuff in and around Baltimore. You just got to look for it.